it really is very difficult that after 2 years and very sporadically effective measures, don't take the mask, they'll hurt you, take the mask, ignoring the old age homes, the economic ruin that's going on. And after we go through 2 whole years of this third variant, you mentioned the Omicron comes in, the information comes by, and as you point out, major and responsible countries, after the 2 years, realizing that, okay, we're into a milder circumstance, we cannot continue claustrophobically to restrict our citizens from their basic rights, they start to lift them. Serious countries start to lift the mandates. And so at the tail, and also, as you mentioned, some of the provinces in Canada. And at this point, a single group, the truckers, who for 2 years were going around delivering food and being regarded as heroes. They live, as people have pointed out, solitary lives. They're alone in their trucks. But after 2 years, at the very, very end, a core of those truckers, and it could be from principles of civil liberties. It could be because they believe that they've already had COVID and therefore they have immune. In other words, there's a whole host of rational reasons that some people would say, no, I have occupation and it's 2 years and all these things are going away. And instead, they're threatened. Their livelihoods are threatened. Their actual livelihoods. And then they I got to get this in. They make this point. They say to Ottawa, they say to their own politicians, why are you doing this? You know, we have worked like others have not worked. We have worked as hard as the medical staff. We have worked as hard as the grocery clerks. And we are the people bringing you the food and, by the way, the supplies for the hospitals. So of all the people to single out the working class trucker, and then they go across Canada in the middle of the winter. There's a week's warning, and here's the key: at no point did any substantial authority, backbencher, minister of finance, or prime minister send out either a delegation or himself and say, look, these guys and gals in these trucks are the heart and soul of this country. Come in and let's have a chat. We're Canadians. We talk about things. We have prided ourselves ever so much that we're so polite and we're so compromising. And we say sorry when someone else hits us. So where did the ethic, the intrinsic ethic of the Canadian temperament disappear? And instead of saying, oh my God, what a joy it would be to talk to someone who's not in cabinet, to talk to someone who does a job, who has kept society functioning. If you guys have problems, I really want to speak to you because I'm your prime minister. And I'm also the prime minister of Canada. But no talk, none at all. And instead, this is the thing that really got my temper up. Instead, out of the blue, like some dark wizard, he comes down on them. They're racists. They're misogynists. They're only a small fringe, but they're taking up space, and we can't tolerate that. I do not know. I really do not. I do not know what was in his mind, what was in the minds of his superlative advisors, presuming that they have them. And I'm also surprised that the Liberal caucus, liberal is a word without a capital letter many, many times. How come all those backbenchers, some of them from the Atlantic provinces, who know the working class, who know fishermen and loggers and miners and oil workers and truckers, they're a class. Does no one stand up for them and instead let the Prime Minister rail at them? And Mr. Singh saying that these are white supremacists and they're calling Islam a disease. Whenever I hear the word irresponsible tossed at the Ottawa protest, it turns me upside down. One more final point, I'll shut up. When have you seen, in America or in Canada, a 2.5-week protest by BLM or Antifa or some environmental group, and not a window smashed, not a police officer attacked, no burning of buildings, no shouting curse words at the police forces, no intimidation. This has been a classic Canadian protest in this sense. that A, it's a working class protest, so it's not professional. And secondly, considering what's at stake, livelihood, restriction of civil liberties, an oppressive hand, an inflammatory rhetoric from the Prime Minister, the fact that the last 2 weeks have been as tranquil as they have, that's a new bloom in the idea of Canadian temperament. Sorry to be so long, but there's been an awful lot of imposition on the tranquilities of every person in this country for the last 2 years. You couldn't visit your sick mother if she was in an old age home. You cannot. Look, Krista Freeland is supposed to be bright. And Mr. Lametti, after some of the things he's been saying, I have to hold judgment on. Where's the threat? There isn't one. This was the longest, most sustained, and almost, you can read it and you can see the live pictures from people who are not in the news media. It was even an almost celebratory thing. If even a delegation of the Trudeau cabinet had walked down the streets of Ottawa, had enough of parkers that they could sit outdoors and spend 2 hours talking to some of these real people, this could have been washed away. So even advocatus diabolus, I cannot do it because I cannot even in fantasy come up with reasons.
Well, let me try. It's got to be that, and I read the other day that because FinTrack never found any evidence of, radical foreigners colluding in a right-wing manner to fund the Freedom Convoy, that most of the information that the government depended on was actually generated by the CBC. And so then we have this feedback loop, right? Well, there's that, yeah, and that's a whole other bloody insane catastrophe, that funding site was hacked by a crazy activist, and then that information was distributed, and that distribution of stolen information is technically illegal, and the media jumped on that and the government capitalized on it. And it's got to be that they believe their own press. And that's so interesting because they bought the press and paid them to tell them what they wanted to hear, and now they believe it and justify their policy as a consequence of that.
Where are the 5 or 6 people in his own cabinet or in his own caucus that are saying, Justin, you have really, really overreached vastly. You have insulted the nature of this country, which is always the middle course, always the willingness to at least try a compromise and a talk. And you've introduced false drama. And that's my explanation. Mm-hmm. Maybe the melodramatic idea of a great national emergency that will flare across the world. Maybe he saw himself as a hero, but if you're following the international press, we're getting a real beating, and happy days or sunny days are not here again.
The NDP opposed the War Measures Act on principle. And Sven Robinson, who's part of that cohort, a little later, but part of that cohort, also opposed it yesterday. And yet Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, from the polls I've read, the followers of the NDP are those most set against what the truckers have done. And he's following Trudeau around like a lapdog.
Well, yeah, you brought it all up, and it's really good. And yes, for the younger people that are watching this, I actually remember, I got a fairly good memory. I remember Tommy Douglas, and when Trudeau brought down the War Measures Act, at least in English Canada, I mean, it swept, it had a lot of visceral and immediate approval, maybe because, this in Quebec, never mind the reasons. It was a winner in the majority of circumstances. But Tommy Douglas was from out west, remember? Tommy Douglas, he braved against that particular wind. He took a hard stand, and he was not, I won't say alone, but he was very close to being isolated, yet he stood up. Here's a maxim for you.
He's the most admired man in Canadian history, by the way, Tommy Douglas, right? There was a poll a couple of years ago, or maybe the CBC ran it, which makes it suspect. But of all the people listed, Tommy Douglas was listed as the most admired political figure in Canadian history. So,
but here was the thing, though. He understood one thing about government, that if a government goes to its greatest extremes and reaches for powers that are normally not accessible, that is the precise moment that the opposition brings itself to its fullest possible energy, even if the government is right. When they are reaching for ultimate and overriding civil liberties, then you have to, it is your duty to stand up and test it again and again and challenge it and exert the greatest pressure. Explain yourself, justify it, limit it, give us the boundaries. And yet in this particular case, the very day, as you have mentioned, that they brought in this thing and let the police loose on the protesters, that's the day that Parliament doesn't even meet. And Mr. Singh will win every student council election in Canada. But his relationship to the working people, the oilmen, the loggers, the fishermen, the farmers, the service people, the truckers, he is an anathema to them. And by the way, he's hurt the reputation and the historical legacy of the party he represents. And I'm not an NDPer, but I can respect and know what they did. And I admire them for that.
Even the Communist Party of Canada announced yesterday that they weren't in favor of the Emergencies Act because they realized that allows instantaneously for the demonization and the criminalization of anything like organized labor protests.
Yeah, of course.
And so obviously,
again, of a majority of people who are out west. Canada is not Ontario and Quebec, however wonderful those provinces are. But it's becoming some sort of, if you're not woke and you're not in the laptop class, and if you're not professionally insulated from all the pressures of COVID, if you can ride around easily, you're in one world. And if those who keep the country functioning, who fix the water mains, who deliver the goods, if they start to feel the pressure and say to their government, we want some hearing, oh, well, they're radicals, they're hypocrites, they're Islamophobes, they're misogynists, and also, of course, they're probably bunching up to being Trump terrorists. And of course, naturally, they're racists. Have you looked at the crowds that were in Ottawa? Did that seem white supreme to you? Some joke. This kind of lazy and distasteful of oversight government, I think that's a fair thing to say. First of all, they saw it as an opportunity to be semi-heroic in its management, even though at the beginning, and I won't go over it, first 2 or 3 months, they were a total mess. But they found it as also a very convenient thing that they don't like question periods, they don't like accountability, they're not getting much force from the press, that they could walk away from that. Then you had this situation where even something so mighty as a national budget, they asked originally for 2 years.
No budget
not
for
to have
1 year,
anything,
right?
They skipped 1 year, but they asked for the powers for 2 years till they got slapped down. They had their SNC and their WE scandal. So this wasn't a good time to have Parliament open in any effective kind of way. Now get to the essential thing. In the period of true crisis, and we'll call the pandemic a true crisis, the most important institution, not essential, quintessential, five times the essence. The quintessential thing is the Commons. And if you bring in emergency legislation and suspend civil liberties and seize bank accounts and phone up people who made legitimate donations to see if they're on side, shut down shopkeepers in Ottawa because you send their names out, that is the ultimate. Look, the Tories in particular should have been standing on those steps screaming at the top of their lungs, why isn't this building open?
That's right. That's right.
That's what they're there for.
Right. Yep, absolutely. They should have gone en masse and through the police to the House of Commons and demanded that the debate take place. It's a catastrophic failure of opposition. So now it's government by fiat and government by experts, and the restriction of what constitutes appropriate lawmaking to one dimension, which is putative public health conceived of in an extraordinarily narrow sense without debate. And then the next thing, and you and I have talked about this a fair bit in private, is the fact that all these bloody governments, including the provincial governments in Canada, have started to rely on nothing but opinion polls as a means of sampling what the public thinks. And I'd like to go into that psychologically for a moment. You know, Canadians now simultaneously, according to the polls, don't want the mandates and don't support the truckers. Now, it doesn't take a bloody genius to notice that those two things are at odds to one another. And so you might think, well, how clueless is the public? And that's not the right conclusion. The right conclusion is, how stupid are we to rely on opinion polls? Because it's extraordinarily difficult to sample what the public thinks. And the reason we have institutions like Parliament, in fact, the actual reason we have institutions like Parliament is because that's a much better method of determining over a long period and in a sustained way what the public thinks when they're thinking carefully over multiple weeks, when many of them are together discussing, and when all of that's organized into something approximating a free political system. Opinion polls subvert all of that.
Not only that, here's another point that builds completely on what you just said. One of the functions, as old as there is a parliament, and especially the mother of all parliaments, of having these great, vast parliamentary reform bill of 1832, is that the debate itself is an agency of the establishment of public opinion. And if you don't have the arguments and the debate, then opinion has no way to fashion itself or to respond to or to modify previous positions. You don't take a static, by the way, these polls are also highly suspect, but leave that be.
Highly methodologically suspect in like
well,
10
not only
methodologically,
I think, and I'll say it out loud, I think some of them are partisan. But I go back to Parliament. If you cannot have a discussion in the parliamentary chamber of bringing in the most serious piece of legislation that we've seen, as you said, in 50 years, what is the point of Parliament? What is it?
Let's go down deeper into Trudeau's motivation. So both Chrystia Freeland and Trudeau are integrally associated with the World Economic Forum. And there's a globalist agenda. This sounds like right-wing propaganda, I suppose, but there is a globalist elite agenda that is aimed at severely modifying the manner in which our fundamental institutions operate under the, what would you call, the impetus of yet another crisis, which is the hypothetical climate crisis. And I'm an admirer of Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's done the best work on this matter, all things considered, methodologically. He's got the best methodology for determining how to analyze what steps should be taken to deal with environmental concerns. I'm not going to call them emergencies. He's documented it very carefully, and I defy anyone on the climate catastrophe side to show evidence of a methodology more sophisticated than Bjorn Lomborg's in terms of analyzing an actual pathway forward that isn't merely apocalyptic neuroticism and the desire for totalitarian control. And so that's all lurking in the background. And so, and that's also pulling the country apart in all sorts of ways, and it's underneath events like the fact that this attack occurred in northern BC the other day on the project
coastal gas link.
The coastal gas line. Exactly. That's part of the attempt to ensure that we all have cheap, reliable energy as we move forward into the future. And so, and I'm going to make it one more case about this. I worked on the UN Secretary General's report on sustainable development for 2 years and analyzed all this sort of material data. And that's where I came across Lomborg, trying to sort this stuff out. And one of the things I learned from doing that was really heartening to me and also kind of catastrophically emotion-provoking was that if you look deeply into the data from as many different perspectives as you could manage, let's say with an open heart, the conclusion that you would derive is that the faster we can get cheap energy to the world's poor people, and the cheaper that energy is, and that's mostly going to be fossil fuels, especially natural gas, if we can do it right, the faster we're going to move towards clean energy in general, the richer people are going to get, and the more sustainable environmental movement we can have in the future. We make the poorest people rich by giving them access to cheap energy, mostly facilitated by fossil fuel. That's the best possible move forward for the planet and for those who are absolutely poor. And again, I defy anyone on the environmental catastrophe side to formulate an argument showing how that's not true. You say, I'm on the side of the oppressed, I'm on the side of the poor. It's like, you're not. If you're not for cheap energy, you're not on that side at all.
We just put in over $500 billion of a deficit, over $1 trillion of a debt. Oil is now ramping up to $80 or $100 a barrel. And the Canadian government has seized Alberta, built a concrete wall around it. And the greatest natural resource we have is frozen. Here's one for you. Maybe the emergencies that we're seeing this week I don't know. Maybe this is one way of forestalling the knowledge that they have got it. At the time of inflation, after 2 years of economic disaster, the one source of wealth that we have, they've closed it down.
There's definitely a moral hazard there, Rex, is that, there's nothing more psychologically attractive than a false crisis to divert attention from a real crisis. And, I've been talking with people who are in the economic know in a very profound manner and who've demonstrated that in a variety of different ways. And one of the facts that was pointed out to me rather forcefully over the last month was that over the last 15 years, Canada's gross domestic product per capita has remained relatively constant at $43,000, while the Americans has moved from approximately that to $65,000. And so that's just one of many indicators that Canada is in a state of economic crisis, the magnitude of which has not yet been entirely revealed, and that the country is tearing itself apart at the seams. And so why not have a false crisis? Because then you can look heroic when you're dealing with something that doesn't exist, and you can beat down the Nazis and the Confederates instead of facing up to the fact that you've been so appallingly incompetent and moralistic over the last 6 years that things are really about to manifest themselves in their true nature.
We don't know yet if once the banks start to rise their interest rates, how this debt will drown us. We also have inflation, but here's the biggest thing of all. Here's the biggest thing, and this didn't happen because of a disease or a pandemic. You mentioned at the beginning, I've been at this far too long, but I have not, and I'm not exaggerating, I'm not being rhetorical. I can't remember a time when there are sharper differences, more angry divisions. We've had contests between provinces, and we've had big fights over pipelines and transmission lines and all sorts of, but it was never carried out with animosity. It never, by the way, called up the brands. I went from 50, 60 years, never heard anyone call anyone a Nazi because they didn't like what they said. A man who comes in and basically says to the world, I am the personification of all that is new and correct in a 21st century virtue. Remember, it's 2015. I am sanctified by my own correctness on all of the genuine issues, and I am going to build a tranquility founded in respect for all Canadians. And 6 years later, you got stallions on Parliament Hill running into walkers. You got the police probably being forced to do stuff that they don't want to. You have a parliament that's been eviscerated or castrated, the biggest debt ever. The West is angry. And we have on the public scene, and it's
the
a sad thing to
opposition is
say,
ineffectual and chaotic.
Yeah, we have
NDP has abandoned the working class. The press is in collusion with the government. Okay, so let's go back in time a bit.
When Alberta was first facing the pillage of its natural resources under the National Energy Program, and that was Pierre Senior. There was then, it was Peter Lougheed, who in many ways was kind of an archetypal premier. He was a premier that basically filled a role. The role didn't fill him. Those two, and they had a certain equality of intellectual or moral presence. They sat at each other in constitutional conferences on television, and I know they sat face to face behind the scenes. Both of them were tough. They were both tough people, and yet there was no residue of, oh, he's a goddamn bastard because he's a Nazi. No, there was enough character in each of them to have a deep and probably irreconcilable difference and still maintain civility and compromise. That's called Canada.
And that is what happened in Canada, is that civility and compromise did prevail up to now. So here's what Canadians are being asked for. They're asked to decide whether these truckers are a reprehensible bunch of foreign-funded Nazi insurrectionists, or whether the entire governing structure in Canada and the press that reports on it has become corrupt in a, what would you say, an historically unmatched manner. And so that's a tough choice, Canadians, but the first part of that isn't true, and the second part, unfortunately, is. And you can tell that not least by the fact that Parliament has essentially been abrogated over the last 2 years, and more particularly on Friday.
There were a lot of those men and women that came for 2 or 3 whole weeks. They were showing a good spirit, and they had their parties. But you know this was hard. They had to spend the money. They got their money seized by the government. They're out there being mocked by the majority of the Canadian press. They don't want to be 3 months in January and February squatting in a truck in front of a Parliament building in the middle of a media storm. So you know something? Now they got the long drive back, and they have been booted out of their national capital. I just say to them, if they listen to you and me on this particular thing, I think you did good stuff, and I think you deserve a hell of a lot more
Thank
support.
God for the working class.
Yeah,
That's
well,
what
the
I
working
think.
class is what keeps the country working. And thanks for your time, Jordan.